Everyone talks about castles and kings, but medieval inns were where real life happened. They were busy, noisy, and full of stories nobody bothered to write down. If you want to know what staying at a medieval inn was really like, it's time to step through the door and find out. If you've ever complained about waiting too long for your food at a restaurant, count yourself lucky you weren't dining in a medieval inn. Back then, eating out wasn't about fancy menus or special dietary requests. It was more about stuffing your belly with whatever the innkeeper managed to catch, find, or scrape together that day. The main dish at most inns was stew. Not the carefully crafted stew with named ingredients your grandmother makes, but a mysterious concoction that changed daily based on whatever meat was available. Rabbit was a lucky find. Squirrel, not so lucky, but still common. The medieval version of Guess the Ingredient wasn't a fun party game. It was dinner. Some travelers even joked that asking what meat was in the stew was the quickest way to lose your appetite. These stews were typically served in wooden bowls alongside a chunk of bread. The bread wasn't your soft, fluffy loaf from the grocery store, but a hard, dense affair that could double as a plate, called a trencher. These edible plates would soak up the stew juices until they were soft enough to eat, assuming you were still hungry after the main meal. If not, these gravy-soaked trenchers were often collected and given to the poor or fed to animals. One thing medieval inns never ran short on was ale. In fact, many places were legally required to have bread and ale available at all times. This wasn't just to keep customers happy. It was a public service. Laws in England dating back to the 1200s required inns along major roads to maintain a supply of food and drink for travelers. The ale was so thick in some places you could stand a spoon in it, if you could find your spoon after dropping it in there. Speaking of yesterday's leftovers, medieval innkeepers were the original food recyclers. Nothing went to waste. That morning's porridge might become part of the evening stew. Monday's stew remnants would make an appearance in Tuesday's pot. This wasn't called food poisoning, it was called being thrifty. The cooking pot in many inns was never fully emptied, just continuously topped up with fresh ingredients. Some traveling merchants claimed certain famous inn stews had been cooking continuously for years. For those with a bit more money to spend, inns sometimes offered slightly better fare. A piece of cheese that hadn't turned completely green or a cut of meat that you could actually identify might cost extra. Fresh fish was a luxury reserved for inns near rivers or coastlines, and even then, fresh was a generous description. Utensils were simple, mostly just knives and spoons. Forks were rare, and most people ate with their hands anyway. Table manners consisted mainly of trying not to stab your dining companion while reaching for the bread. Meals were typically served at fixed times, and everyone ate together at long wooden tables. This communal eating was how news traveled, deals were made, and arguments started. Your dining companions might range from local farmers to traveling merchants, all crowded shoulder to shoulder on wooden benches that had seen better days. As night fell and bellies were full of questionable stew, those same dining benches would often transform into something else entirely. Your bed, and if you thought sharing a table with strangers was intimate, wait until you hear about medieval sleeping arrangements. After filling your belly with mystery stew, you'd need somewhere to rest your weary bones. Modern hotels offer private rooms with locks, clean sheets, and do not disturb signs. Medieval inns offered none of these luxuries. Instead, they provided an early version of social networking, whether you wanted it or not. The concept of a private bedroom was almost unheard of in most medieval inns. Common travelers slept in what we might call communal bedrooms, though calling them rooms is being generous. Often, these sleeping areas were simply the same hall where everyone had just finished eating. The tables would be pushed aside, straw mattresses rolled out, and suddenly dinner hall became dormitory. These sleeping spaces followed one simple rule: pack in as many bodies as possible. A typical inn might have just one or two large sleeping areas with several beds, each designed to hold multiple people. And by designed, we mean the innkeeper had decided that 4 grown adults could fit in a bed that modern standards would consider small for 2 people. The medieval innkeeper's motto might well have been, "There's always room for one more, especially if that one more has coins to pay." Beds themselves were basic affairs, wooden frames with rope supports and mattresses stuffed with straw, hay, or if you were at a fancy establishment, wool. Sheets, if provided at all, were rarely changed between guests. Pillows were small sacks also stuffed with hay or wool. Bed bugs, fleas, and lice were such common bedfellows that they weren't even worth complaining about. They were simply expected travel companions. Records from 14th century England show that town councils sometimes had to pass laws requiring innkeepers to change bed linens at least once every 3 months, a fact that tells you everything you need to know about hygiene standards of the time. The true horror of medieval inn sleeping wasn't just the questionable cleanliness, it was the complete lack of privacy. Travelers routinely shared beds with total strangers. Your bedmates might include merchants, pilgrims, or local drunks who couldn't make it home. You'd fall asleep next to someone whose name you didn't know, but whose snoring patterns you'd never forget. Only the wealthiest travelers could expect any sort of private accommodations. A rich merchant or minor noble might secure a small chamber with a single bed, though this luxury came at a steep price. These private rooms often had only thin walls and doors without locks. Privacy was a concept still centuries away from being considered a right. Even in these better accommodations, you weren't truly alone. Rats, mice, and various insects considered your room their territory long before you arrived. The mice didn't pay for their lodging, but they certainly expected full access to the facilities. A particularly odd custom that seemed shocking to modern sensibilities was the practice of body servants or attendants sleeping at the foot of their master's bed. A nobleman might have his personal guard sleeping across the doorway of his chamber, partly for protection, partly because there simply wasn't anywhere else to put him. Travelers often brought their own bedding, a wise precaution given the state of inn-provided linens. Many carried sleeping sacks that could be laid over the questionable mattress as a barrier against both its mysterious stains and resident insects. As disturbing as these sleeping conditions seem to us now, they served an important social function. News, gossip, business deals, and friendships were all forged in these communal sleeping quarters. Many travelers actually looked forward to the connections made while sharing these cramped conditions. With everyone finally bedded down for the night, packed like salted fish in a barrel, and trying to ignore the symphony of snores, the inn would finally quiet down. Or would it? Because once the candles were blown out, an entirely different kind of entertainment often began. Just because the sun went down didn't mean the fun stopped at medieval inns. Nightfall often marked the beginning of the real entertainment, with firelight and boisterous laughter creating the perfect backdrop for medieval nightlife. Drinking was the main attraction. Medieval ale wasn't the clear, fizzy beer we know today. It was thick, cloudy, and often warm, like liquid bread with a kick. Records show the average medieval person consumed up to 1 gallon of ale daily. This wasn't just for enjoyment. Water was often unsafe to drink. Ale, having been boiled during brewing, was actually safer. When the tavern keeper asked if you wanted another round, it wasn't just good business, it was a public health service. Dice was the gambling game of choice in most inns. Simple to play and easy to cheat at, dice games could turn friendly strangers into bitter enemies in minutes. Many games ended in heated arguments, which explains why many towns had laws against wearing weapons inside taverns. Singing was another popular entertainment. Rowdy group songs with countless verses that everyone seemed to know. Stories of heroes, impossible loves, or great battles grew louder and less coherent as the night progressed. By the 10th verse, even the inn's cat could sing along better than most of the patrons. Some inns attracted traveling performers. Minstrels, storytellers, and jesters would perform for food, drink, and perhaps a better sleeping spot. These performers brought stories and information from distant towns along with their entertainment. Tavern brawls were so common, they were practically scheduled events. A good night was measured by how few teeth were lost. Innkeepers usually kept large sticks handy to restore order when necessary. The most valued entertainment was gossip. News traveled slowly in medieval times, and inns served as information hubs. In an age without newspapers, an evening in a tavern was how most people learned what was happening in the world. When the town curfew bell rang, guests would reluctantly retire to their communal beds. The smarter travelers claimed sleeping spots quickly. The slowest might end up next to the person who'd been the loudest during tonight's drinking songs. With entertainment concluded and bodies crammed into shared quarters, everyone was expected to follow certain rules. But as you might imagine, the rules of medieval inn stays were about as effective as trying to herd cats through an open field. Rules existed at medieval inns, though following them was another matter entirely. Unlike the clearly posted guidelines you might find in modern hotels, medieval inn rules were more like strong suggestions backed by the innkeeper's heavy stick. First rule: pay on time or face the consequences. Innkeepers weren't running charity houses, they needed payment, and they weren't afraid to take collateral. Records from 13th century England show travelers who couldn't pay their bills might have their horses, clothing, or even weapons confiscated until debts were settled. Some unfortunate guests who couldn't cover their tab ended up working off their debt by mucking out stables, definitely a downgrade from the already questionable accommodations inside. Second rule: no sword fighting inside the building. This might seem obvious, but it was common enough that many towns had specific ordinances forbidding it. The fine for sword drawing in a London tavern in 1273 was 20 shillings, a hefty sum when a night's lodging might cost just a penny. Smaller knives, however, were permitted since everyone carried them for eating. The line between eating knife and fighting knife was conveniently blurry. Third rule: keep the noise down after curfew. Most medieval towns rang bells to signal curfew, typically around 9 in winter and 10 in summer. After this time, indoors were supposed to be locked and quiet maintained. In reality, these rules applied mainly to smaller inns in residential areas. Larger establishments on main roads often continued their revelry well into the night, especially if local officials were among the revelers. Fourth rule: don't steal from other guests. While this seems like common sense, theft was rampant in medieval inns. Some innkeepers posted warnings that they weren't responsible for stolen goods, while others offered secure storage for valuables, at an additional fee, of course. Travelers quickly learned to sleep with their money pouches under their pillows or tied around their necks. Fifth rule: don't bring disease into the inn. During plague outbreaks, travelers showing symptoms could be turned away without question. Given the limited medical knowledge of the time, this meant anyone with a cough, fever, or suspicious spots might find themselves sleeping in the woods. Some towns required travelers to remain outside city walls for several days before entering, a primitive form of quarantine. The enforcement of these rules varied wildly. In small villages where everyone knew each other, social pressure kept most guests in line. In busy market towns or along major highways, enforcement depended largely on how much influence or money a guest had. A wealthy merchant might break every rule in the book and receive nothing more than a polite cough from the innkeeper, while a poor traveler could be thrown out for accidentally spilling a mug of ale. Court records from medieval England show that innkeepers themselves were subject to strict regulations. They could be fined for watering down ale, using false measures, or allowing gambling after curfew. In 1309, an innkeeper in York was fined the equivalent of 2 weeks' profits for selling ale in unmarked containers, a serious offense when standard measures were legally required. Some inns developed their own house rules beyond legal requirements. Guests might be expected to share in morning prayers, contribute firewood for common areas, or help with simple chores during longer stays. Whether these tasks were completed with good cheer or grumbling complaints depended largely on how much ale had been consumed the night before. Despite these attempts at order, medieval inns weren't exactly safe havens for travelers. Between the questionable food, shared sleeping quarters, and fellow guests of dubious character, staying at an inn sometimes felt like jumping from the frying pan into the fire. Even with rules posted and innkeepers watching, medieval inns had a well-earned reputation as dangerous places. Travelers with full purses often found themselves with empty ones by morning. Robbery wasn't just a risk on the road. It continued right under the supposedly safe roof of the inn. Many inns throughout Europe gained notoriety as centers for criminal activity. Some innkeepers actively worked with thieves, helping to identify wealthy targets among their guests. The arrangement was simple. The innkeeper provided information about which rooms held the richest travelers, and the thieves shared a cut of whatever they stole. Court records from 14th century England contain hundreds of cases involving innkeepers charged as accomplices in robberies of their own guests. Your innkeeper might serve you the worst stew of your life, but at least he gave you a roof over your head and detailed directions to the thieves about which bed you were sleeping in. The methods used by inn thieves were surprisingly clever. Some would drill small holes in the walls between rooms to peek at guests, counting their money. Others would wait until guests were deep in drunken sleep before creeping into the communal sleeping areas. The smarter criminals would strike up friendly conversations with travelers during dinner, learning about their business and wealth while sharing drinks. In response to these dangers, medieval travelers developed their own safety measures. Many would sew gold coins into the hems of their clothes. Others wore special money belts under their tunics. Merchants often traveled in groups, taking turns keeping watch at night. Legal records from Paris in the early 1300s show that approximately 1 in 5 reported crimes occurred at or near inns. The number was likely much higher, as many victims wouldn't bother reporting thefts when they were just passing through town. Not all dangers came from deliberate criminal activity. Fire was a constant threat in medieval buildings. Inns, with their large cooking fires, numerous candles, and often drunk patrons, were particularly vulnerable. A fire that started in an inn could quickly spread to surrounding buildings. For this reason, many towns had strict rules about when cooking fires had to be extinguished. In London, the curfew bell literally signaled the time to cover fire. Couvre-feu in French. Food poisoning was another common hazard. With no refrigeration and questionable food preparation standards, a bad meal could leave travelers violently ill. Records from monastery hospitals near major roads show frequent cases of travelers seeking treatment for stomach ailments after dining at roadside inns. Disease spread rapidly in the close quarters of inns. During the plague years, staying at a crowded inn was particularly risky. Some towns actually banned travelers during outbreaks, forcing them to camp outside city walls. Then there was the risk of the road itself. Robbers often watched inns, noting when wealthy travelers departed and following them to isolated spots. Some bandits were practically taking reservations by listening to travel plans discussed over dinner. This danger led to the common practice of travelers leaving inns in groups, even if they just met, for mutual protection. Perhaps the most concerning aspect of inn safety was how few legal protections existed for travelers. As an outsider in a strange town, you had little recourse if you were robbed or cheated. Local courts heavily favored residents over visitors. Unless you were a noble or had powerful connections, justice was rarely served. Despite all these dangers, medieval people continued to travel, and inns continued to serve a crucial function. They were necessary evils, dangerous, dirty, and uncomfortable, but still better than sleeping in a ditch. People developed strategies to stay safe. So, with all the dangers, discomforts, and dubious stew, why did medieval travelers keep choosing inns? The answer lies in what these establishments provided beyond just a roof and a bed. Inns served as the communication centers of their age. In a world without phones, internet, or reliable postal systems, inns became the places where information flowed most freely. Merchants learned about market conditions in distant towns. Farmers heard about weather patterns affecting crops. Craftspeople exchanged techniques and innovations. The medieval inn was basically social media, except the trolls could actually punch you. These establishments played a crucial role in developing what would eventually become postal routes. By the late 1300s, some inns had formal arrangements to pass letters along to the next inn on the road. Messengers would stop at inns to rest, creating natural relay points. This informal system eventually grew into more organized mail delivery services. Records from 15th century German territories show that certain innkeepers received official payments for holding and transferring messages. Inns also marked the way for travelers in a time before detailed maps or road signs. Their presence defined important routes and junctions. Many modern highways follow paths that were originally marked by medieval inns, placed a day's journey apart. In England alone, over 300 current roads contain inn in their names, marking where these establishments once stood. For traders and merchants, inns provided more than accommodation. They offered secure places to store goods. Many had locked storerooms where valuable merchandise could be kept overnight. This security, despite its imperfections, allowed trade to flourish. The economic impact was significant enough that some medieval towns offered tax incentives to establish inns along major trade routes. Inns became natural places for business deals and contracts. Records from trading centers like Bruges and Florence show that innkeepers often served as witnesses to business transactions. Some specialized inns became known as places where certain types of merchants gathered. Wool traders, spice merchants, or metal workers would know which establishments catered to their industry. For town and city authorities, inns provided a way to monitor who was coming and going. Many regions required innkeepers to report their guests to local officials. This practice began as a security measure, but evolved into an early form of tourism management. By the mid-1400s, some Italian cities were collecting data on visitor numbers through inn registrations. Surprisingly, inns also contributed to public health. While their sanitation was questionable by modern standards, towns with established inns tended to develop better waste disposal systems to accommodate the increased population density. Archaeological digs at medieval inn sites often reveal more advanced drainage systems than those found in ordinary homes of the same period. Cultural exchange flowered at inns, where travelers from different regions shared stories, songs, and customs. Food and cooking techniques spread along inn routes. The common practice of households mainly eating what they grew locally was challenged by inn kitchens that incorporated ingredients and recipes from various regions. An innkeeper once claimed he could tell where a traveler was from not by their accent, but by how much they complained about his ale compared to their local brew. Some inns specialized in catering to specific types of travelers. Pilgrim inns provided religious services and guidance. Merchant inns offered scales for weighing goods and large tables for examining merchandise. Inns near universities welcomed scholars and students with quieter rooms and better lighting for reading. As centuries passed, many of these establishments grew in reputation and service quality. Some of Europe's oldest operating hotels today began as medieval inns. The Beau Rivage in Geneva, the Old Bell in England, and others trace their roots back hundreds of years. These humble beginnings shaped how we understand hospitality to this day, though thankfully with fewer bedbugs and mystery stews. From communication hubs to business centers, from security checkpoints to cultural melting pots, medieval inns were far more than just places to eat and sleep. They were the essential infrastructure that made more complex societies possible, connecting people and places in ways that would forever change how humans interact.